Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, put forward his influential designation, influential but much criticized distinction of non-overlapping magisteria, which is the essential idea that there are religion and science form two distinct fields of relatively non-overlapping, hence the non-overlapping part, and relatively exclusive authority, with science dealing with a domain of facts and religion dealing with a domain of human value. And this is built upon a history of epistemology which essentially views religion as having been dominant prior to the 17th century, and then science becoming increasingly dominant after the 17th century with the Age of Enlightenment and discovery. To quote from Stephen Jay Gould, "NOMA represents a principled position on moral and intellectual grounds, not a mere diplomatic stance. NOMA also cuts both ways. If religion can no longer dictate the nature of factual conclusions properly under the magisterium of science, then scientists cannot claim higher insight into moral truth from any superior knowledge of the world's empirical constitution. This mutual humility has important practical consequences in a world of such diverse passions." So, Sotiris, what is your view of Gould's NOMA solution to the conflict between religious and scientific domains? Or would you even accept that there
Perhaps
is...
Ferdia should be asked first, because he has something very particular to say.
Okay,
sorry
Ferdia. That's perfectly right. What is your view on Gould's NOMA solution to fact-value conflict between religious and scientific communities?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and I think it cuts straight to the heart of the issue, for me anyway. So I think that Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria idea is a well-intentioned attempt to integrate, to socially integrate religion and science and deal with conflict, but I think it fails for fundamental reasons, because it's basically it's an unreconstructed assertion of the fact-value distinction, right? So, we could describe it as a kind of pacifistic positivism. So it takes this idea of the division between the positive and the normative. There are facts that are true of the empirical world that can be discovered and verified by science and mathematics and logic. And then there's the normative world of norms and feelings and sentiments and morals and ethical judgments and purposes, and never the two should meet. The difference here is that rather than like other positivists rejecting the normative world, Gould is saying that there should just be toleration between them. So where I'd begin with this is I would look at this fact-value distinction and immediately ask a question similar to how Sotiris began by interrogating the very distinction between religion and non-religion, and ask, what do we mean by a fact and a value? So again, coming from the pragmatist perspective, but this has its basis in other traditions as well. If we observe humans thinking and talking and acting and try to find a pure fact or a pure value living in the wild alone, we can't find it. For example, if we look at science, so previously I described science as an ethical project. Even the idea of what we consider to be a fact is value laden. The idea of being methodical, the idea of valuing certain sources of information or knowledge more than others. Science, for example, is not favorable, does not like mystical or intuitive revelation to be a source of knowledge. That's a value judgment. The idea that we need to do experiments, that these need to be replicable, etc. These are all value judgments. And equally, the idea of having ethical purposes and judgments devoid of any kind of sense of what the nature or the factual status of the world we live in is, it doesn't make any sense at all. Ethics are always naturalistic, whether we admit it or not. So I think that when we contend with that essentialist distinction between fact and value and see how that breaks down, we need to come up with another strategy for dealing with the conflicts between what we call religion and science.
Might I just interject a question here? Does your position here vis-a-vis pragmatism ultimately, correct me if I'm wildly off course, ultimately result in us saying that there is a kind of emotivism, that there are no propositions which aren't, in some sense, not just value laden but affect laden as well, which would bring you to a more radical position vis-a-vis the nature of propositions.
Yes, except pragmatists wouldn't describe themselves as emotivists and said, like ethically speaking, sentimentalists. I mean, I'm
but you wouldn't. You would. But you are.
But what I'm saying is,
you're rejecting You're rejecting a certain standard of scientific objectivity, though.
Yes, absolutely. To a pragmatist, the idea of objectivity is a nonsense, as in the sense of objective means getting away from. It's a non-perspectival position. Pragmatists would say, please find me this non-perspectival position. And what you'll actually find is a particular human in a particular place and in a particular time with a particular background, with particular human limitations and capacities saying something. And then this is going off into something else. But so what that doesn't mean is throwing science out the window, throwing care as regards knowledge out the window, but it does lead to a radically different position. I think it's only from this position that we can understand things like the conflicts between what we call science and religion. And we immediately go then into political and social struggle. And like you brought up earlier, you're talking about if we look at religion sociologically and think about it in terms of authority and democracy and these kinds of things, I think that this is much more fruitful. And I'll leave my comments there and Sotiris can come in.